Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Ask Tell. I'm Adam Kadri. This time around, we have 3 more games from 2007, and all 3 are by authors I hung out with for about a decade back on IFMUD. First up, we have Lost Pig by an author who writes under the name Admiral Hota. And here to talk about it with me is Kat Zhang. So, what's this one about?
Lost Pig is a game where you play as an orc who is employed at a farm for some reason, and one of the pigs escapes, so you have to go out and find the pig.
Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. And yet, this was the most acclaimed piece of interactive fiction of the year 2007. Not only did it win the comp that year, both among the regular voters and among the other authors, but it also won Zizzy Awards for Best Game, Best Writing, Best Non-Player Character, and Best Player Character. And it was voted the second best IF game of all time in polls in 2011 and then again in 2019. So, I was expecting a bit more than what this turns out to be. With all those accolades, I was expecting a sprawling saga where you wander around a faux medieval fantasy world as an orc, looking for your runaway pig and having all sorts of adventures along the way. And then it turns out that the entire game takes place over something like half a dozen locations, all in a cave.
Yeah, at the start of the game, it looks like there's a big game world, and then you take one step and you fall down a hole, and then the rest of the game takes place over 5 rooms or something.
There's a bit where you go east, and you get to an underground stream, and the narration says, "Grunk not see much on other side. Not know if tunnel keep going or stop here." And I thought, oh, okay, I get it. I need to find a light source, and once I do that, more of the tunnel will be revealed, and it'll unlock another part of the game world. But then I did find a light source, and no, it's just a wall. There's nothing on the other side of that stream. I was actually kind of shocked because until I started this show, I had almost completely lost touch with what was going on in the IF world from 2002 onward. But even I had heard of Lost Pig. It's so well regarded, almost universally proclaimed the best game of the entire decade of the 2000s. And the whole thing takes place in this one little cave?
I feel like it's a little bit unfair to criticize the game for having won so many awards, but I was a little bit disappointed by the game. And that's not really the game's fault. Like, if I just played it on my own, I'd think, what a nice little game. But, like, going into it knowing that it's won all this stuff, I guess my reaction was more like, oh, that's it. But that's not really a fault of anything to do with the game. Like, there's not some, like, huge glaring flaw with the game. It's more just the fact that it's got all these accolades, and then it's a very small game that doesn't really have much to say and nothing really happens in it. Actually, it's a bit odd because there's a lot of things in the game that have clearly had a lot of effort put into it. Like, like the gnome character, he's got a response for just about anything that you could ask him about. And that must have taken a long time to write. But then at the same time, the game only has like 4 puzzles or something. And yet a couple of the puzzles are like, in my opinion, like they're not very well clued. And should I get into the main puzzle that I got stuck on?
Yeah, please do.
The main thing that got me, I guess, is that some aspects of the game seem to have had a lot of effort put into it, whereas a lot of the rest of the game is like pretty thin. So the main puzzle that I had trouble with was lighting the torch, because you've got a torch, but the torch went out when you fell down the hole. And then you discover this powder in the cave that catches fire when you put water on it, and you've got a hat that you've stolen off a statue that you can use as a bowl. So my first thought was I could put powder in the hat and then I could pour water in the hat to make fire. But the hat can't contain 2 things at once the way it's coded. So if the hat's already full of powder and you try to put water in it, then the game just tells you the hat's already full. Or vice versa, which I also tried. And then like you're wearing a pair of pants and you can take the pants off and you can rip the pants. And I thought, I'll rip the pants into rags and then wrap it around the torch or something and set the rags on fire. But unfortunately, you can rip the pants, but you can't rip them any further. They just become pants with a hole in them. And then I thought, well, I'll dip the torch in water and then I'll dip the wet torch into the powder to make it catch fire and light the torch. But unfortunately, that also doesn't do anything. I tried dipping the torch in water and sticking it in the powder, and dipping the torch in the powder and sticking it in water, and neither of those things worked. And it turns out what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to fill the hat with water and then pour the water into the whole box of powder, which seems like something that would just deplete the entire box of powder immediately, but you can do this an unlimited number of times. And then the box of powder will catch fire, and then you can stick the torch into the fire, and that lights the torch on fire, which I thought was quite a limited solution. And by that time, I'd run out of ideas. It didn't even occur to me to do that.
Okay, that's very interesting to me. Personally, I didn't run into that problem simply because I don't really have patience for these puzzles. So whenever I found myself stuck, I went straight to the hints. That's usually what I do, so I can sort of kick the obstacles out of the way and get to the content. The problem is that here, there's nothing to get to. As you say, this game isn't about anything other than its puzzles and its jokes. Now, I can totally see how the jokes are one of the reasons people would like this game.
Yeah, there's a lot of bits of writing that are quite funny. Like when you try to walk up to the pig, or when you try to grab the pig, you get a message that says something like, Grunk, walk right up to pig. Pig, walk right away from Grunk. Or there's this part where if you examine the room where the gnome is, I actually wrote this one down. He describes it as, this look like room for a little person. It have bed that too little for Grunk. It have trunk that too little for Grunk. It have desk that too little for Grunk. Desk have stool that too little for Grunk. Room have doorway to east and west too, but them not so little. That good because of doorway too little for Grunk. Not know how Grunk get back out of room. And it's just like, it's so dumb, but I thought that was pretty good.
Mm-hmm. And if you are into puzzles, there are plenty of those. I read a lot of people writing about how they liked the color magnet, for instance. That's the one puzzle I did figure out on my own. The deal there is that there's this stick that will repel things of the same color and attract things of the opposite color. So you can cover it with soot, turning it black, and that allows you to pull a white piece of paper out of a deep crevice. So there you go, a memorable IF puzzle. But again, it's not about anything. It doesn't have any thematic or emotional content. So what I found interesting about your experience with the fire puzzle is that it seemed to me that the other big strength of this game, and what I assume is at least half the reason it won all these awards, is depth of implementation. The sense that the author thought of everything. That no matter what you might type in, the author has anticipated your command and has queued up a perfect response in Grunk's voice. But your experience suggests that while that may be true on the surface level, it might not be true on a deeper level. That the author either hadn't considered your solutions to the puzzle in question, or at least hadn't built into the game satisfying explanations as to why those solutions didn't work.
Yeah, and it's strange, like in contrast to some of the other stuff that's been implemented in the game. Like there's a machine that gives you cake when you put a coin in it. So like you've got to put the coin in the slot, and then you got to pull the lever, and then the cake falls into a box, which then you have to grab the cake, and then you have to get your coin back. So that's like a number of steps. And then after you've done this a couple of times, the game just does it for you automatically, which is like quite handy. But it's a bit odd that some things are handled so well and then some other aspects of the game are so thin. And then I guess also like the depth of the implementation is, it's a very small game. Like it's easy to think of everything when your game is 5 rooms. I think I would have preferred if it was like a bit bigger and a bit more ambitious and slightly less well implemented. But I mean, then it would just be a completely different game, I guess.
So to a certain extent, I can understand Lost Pig's seeming lack of ambition. It's a comp game. The annual IF comp was started in 1995 by Kevin Wilson, who basically said, you know, back in the 80s, when you were shelling out $30 for an Infocom game, which is close to $100 in 2024 money, you wanted to get your money's worth. Getting through a game should mean playing every evening for a month, or you got ripped off. Which meant either that the game had to be really long, or the puzzles had to be really tough, or more likely both. But, Kevin said, now it's the 90s, and the games are free, so there's no question of getting your money's worth. Yet, people are still trying to make Infocom scale games, And that means we only get a couple of games a year. So, here's a competition for small games, finishable in 2 hours. And maybe with that impetus to write something more manageable, we'll get a dozen games a year. And the comp succeeded. In fact, it succeeded to the point that for a while there, pretty much all games were comp games. Because if you entered your game in the comp, you knew you'd get at least a couple hundred players, and if you released it outside the comp, maybe you'd get 10. So people were entering games into the comp that had no business being there because they weren't finishable in 2 hours. They might take 4 or 6 or 10. Maybe you could finish in 2 hours with a walkthrough. So, if Hota was trying to keep to the spirit of the comp, then half a dozen rooms make sense. But that still raises the question of why it won not just the comp, but all these other rewards on top.
That's true. It may have just been a very weak year.
Maybe, but even in 2019, you had people voting at number 2 of all time. Which I guess brings up Rachel's question from a few episodes ago. Who are these voters? I have no idea who was voting in 2019. What I can say is that 20 years earlier, when we'd finally had some IF come out that broke from the puzzle-solving model, there was a backlash, with posts going up on the news group saying, "I don't like interactive fiction. I like text adventures. If I wanted to read a story, I wouldn't be on a computer. I'd pick up a book." But again, we're past the days when you blow your entertainment budget on a single game and need to make it last a month. It probably says something that the 2 of my games that people have played the most by far are not the ones I put the most work into. Not Endless Nameless, not Narcolepsy, not Varicella, but Photopia, which you can play through in under half an hour, and 905, which takes what, 5 minutes? Maybe 10 if you take your time? So maybe the fact that Lost Pig doesn't extend beyond a few rooms is one of the reasons it's so popular. But I really don't know. I guess my question at this point is, do you have a preference when it comes to short games versus longer ones?
I don't think I've ever played an Infocom type IF game, like nothing that long. I don't think I really have any sort of length preference, except I think I would prefer that it not be so long that I have to play it for a month. But every piece of IF that I've played has, I mean, first of all, it's usually been written by like a single person laboring away. They've all been pretty small, even if they aren't a comp game. And I think I agree with you that most of the comp games are actually not comp length, but they're also not particularly long, you know. I wouldn't put any of them over like 5 hours, for example. I remember like back when I played more IF, the longer games that I would have played would have included like Varicella, but even that isn't particularly long.
Well, the gimmick there is that in the game world, Varicella lasts 2 hours, just like a comp game, even though it wasn't one. But the expectation is that you'll need to play through those 2 hours a dozen times, refining your strategy before you succeed. To turn to the other awards Lost Pig won, Best Player Character and Best Writing sort of go together, I suppose, since all the narration is filtered through Grunk's perspective. But it also won Best Non-Player Character, for the gnome, not the pig. And I can see how, sure, the gnome has a response to virtually any topic related to the game world. You could spend an hour just talking to the gnome. But I don't know why you'd want to, because those responses didn't strike me as particularly interesting. He's an inventor with a bland personality. Some of his answers set up jokes, but the funny lines come from Grunk, not the gnome. So this struck me as an award for quantity more than quality.
I guess I agree that the gnome is probably the least interesting of the three. I enjoyed Grunk's character. He's a bit of a big dumb guy cliche, but he is entertaining. The other thing is, like, I really like the pig NPC, and I was very disappointed that at the end of the game you just take the pig back to the farm. I was expecting something else, I suppose. Like, you know, the pig is implemented in the game as if it's an intelligent character, you know, like the game's always telling you how the pig's looking at you as if it knows something. And you can ask it things and you can tell it things the same as you can with the other NPC, the gnome. So you can tell about anything. You can ask about anything. Like the pig doesn't respond, but you know, you can do that. And I did, in fact, talk to the pig a lot, despite the fact that the pig doesn't say anything back. And, you can feed it cakes. As it turns out, feeding the pig little cakes is just part of a puzzle to be able to grab the pig, and then you just have the pig. But when you put the cake down, the pig's like kind of suspicious, and it comes over and like sniffs the cake, and then it starts eating the cake. And I fed the pig a lot of cake thinking that I could, maybe get the pig to trust me a bit more. Or I thought maybe there might be something else in the game to make the pig like me more. And I was imagining that at some point, the pig might just hang out with me of its own volition. So, I thought I could be buddies with the pig. The way the pig was written, it seemed like it had its own ideas. But then, like, in the end, you just pick it up like an object and then you take it back to the farm where it's presumably going to be slaughtered to make bacon at some point. So that was a little bit of a letdown.
Yeah, I guess it does preclude Lost Pig 2, where Grunk and the pig are a crime-fighting duo.
Yeah, see? I mean, I suppose the pig could escape again.
Well, I think what actually happens in the world of the story is that Grunk leaves the farm and joins the army, and his exploits appear on his live journal. I think he had about 4 or 5 months worth of adventures back in 02 and 03. And that actually makes for an unexpectedly smooth transition to our next segment, because Hota has said that Grunk's live journal was inspired by another live journal that was initially set in a faux medieval fantasy world, and that one was written by our next author, Stephen Grenade. Stephen's game Child's Play won the Zizzy Award for Best Non-Player Characters as a group, and was nominated for Best Game. In it, you play a baby, like maybe a year old, during a play date with a group of about half a dozen similarly aged babies. Your goal is to get hold of your favorite toy and keep it out of the hands of your rival. I did not realize that that was what this game was about. I put it on the list for a couple of reasons. One is that Stephen is someone I know personally. I even stayed over at his house once back in my IFMUD days. He had a chinchilla. The other is that Ellie had indicated some interest in appearing on the IF podcast, so I was looking for a game that might be a good match. This one had child in the title, and Ellie's a preschool teacher. It was not a good match.
I'm not really interested in babies from either like a child development standpoint or a gameplay standpoint, because the children in this game, the only way they could get their needs met would be to like cry and scream. They're like completely pre-verbal.
So one of the challenges of any piece of interactive fiction that presents players with a prompt where you can type in anything is how to avoid having to come up with the responses to 100,000 different commands. In this case, making the player character a baby does the trick, because it does limit the player immensely. As you say, they can't talk. Here, they can't walk either. They can crawl. They can pull themselves up on things. But yeah, these aren't even toddlers.
I found it annoying. I found it hellish to be trapped in the body of someone who is totally limited by what their body is capable of. The idea that you want to get up and go around and do things and talk to people and sort things out, but you can't because you're a baby, like that's hellish. And, one might say that's what it's like being a baby. That's why they cry all the time. But like, that's not true, because a baby doesn't know yet what it's not capable of. It's basically just sitting there absorbing stimuli all day. And if it had been a game about 2, 3, or 4-year-olds, that's a case where that would have been accurate. A 2-year-old is a person who has thoughts. They're not very complex thoughts. They're very fanciful and not logically consistent, but she can think, she can come up with a plan of action that has 2 or 3 steps. She can talk to her friends. The things that she says or the emotional reaction she has to things aren't going to make much sense, but it would have at least been more accurate to life to have this character who wants to do things but is limited by his or her body, because a baby doesn't even know it's alive, pretty much. Like, it's still figuring out what its hands are. Whereas even with 4 and 5-year-olds, when I'm sitting with them, teaching them how to write a word or doing a drawing with them, They get so frustrated over not being able to execute a creative vision they have in their minds. She'll be like, well, I really want to draw a mermaid, but I can't draw mermaids like you. I'm trying so hard and I can't make the tail have the right number of scales or whatever. And she'll try to draw arms and they'll look all deformed. Or even just letter formation. They know how they're supposed to write their letters, but when they try it on their own, they just can't get it right. They'll do it backwards or upside down, and they'll need me to make dots so they can connect the dots. And when they express frustration about this, I find myself telling these 4 and 5-year-old children, the muscles in your hands are literally not formed yet. Like your bones aren't even fused together yet. I know that it's hard and it's frustrating, but the only way that your hands are going to be able to get strong enough to do what you want them to do is to practice. When you're older, you will have more control over your body. I know it's frustrating right now, but you've just got to stick with it. So yeah, even kids who are as fully formed as pre-K age deal with this, but this sort of, I have a plan, but I can't fully execute the plan narrative limitation would make a lot more sense with a 3-year-old. Babies, no. I don't think babies are interesting. I think a game about preschool age children would have been interesting. Children who are verbal, even a child who's got some emerging language skills like around 2 years old, that would be more interesting.
I'm interested to hear you say that because I know that you have a history of getting hired with the understanding that you specialize in ages 4 to 5, and then they stick you with the 2-year-olds and you hate it.
When you're 2, because you're independent for the first time in terms of your mobility, but you're not aware enough of your surroundings or you don't even have good proprioception yet, it's just agonizing being a 2-year-old. When somebody takes your toy, it does feel like the end of the world. And so 2-year-olds scream a lot. And I find that it takes so much more patience to be around 2-year-olds because logic and reasoning do not work with them. Their brains are completely pre-logic. With kids who are like 3 and up, you might experience random resistance from time to time when you're asking them to do something and they just decide that they don't feel like doing it. And you can talk them out of feeling this way, or you can make it into like a fun game. I bet you can put your shoes on in 10 seconds, like that sort of thing. But when you're 2, adults telling you what to do, sometimes like it feels like it's a threat to your emerging sense of self because you've learned what the word no means and you've learned that you have a body and that other people can't make your body do things physically because you are the one who controls your arms and legs. And so any opportunity that feels like you have a choice in the matter, even if it's not really a choice, you're going to bristle at times when the adults in charge of you have a different plan for you and you can't be reasoned with. Saying like, well, we need to put your shoes on so that your feet don't get hurt by the broken glass that's on the ground outside. None of that sinks in. All they know is, I don't want to wear shoes right now, and this person is telling me I have to wear shoes, and they're not listening to me, and it feels like the end of the world. And so having to coax someone through this terrible drama at every turn is extremely taxing emotionally. And this is something I'm getting better at, but I didn't want to have to get better at it. I wanted to spend my time teaching children how to read and write rather than please don't eat sand because it's not good for your body. So I guess this game is kind of a reflection of that pattern. Like I wanted to play a super fun game about kids who are little people who are pretty new to the world but have a very vague sense of how it works and have an emerging sense of autonomy, but still have the limitations of being a child. I thought that would be fun, but instead it's,
So that certainly sheds light on why they're called the Terrible Twos. But it sounds like despite all that, you'd rather play a 2-year-old than a 1-year-old. So why is 2 better than 1?
Because children at this age don't have theory of mind. It's something that they start working on as infants when they start recognizing other human faces and tracking people's eye movements. And it's a process that continues throughout the child's life. And I think it would have been cool to have a character who doesn't realize that other people are humans who have a consciousness separate from their own. Kids don't really start realizing that other people have minds until age 3 or 4. And that also means that very young children aren't capable of dishonesty or deception. 2-year-olds will tell lies about things, but it's experimental. They want to see what they can get away with. So I think that that would have been an interesting thing to have be a part of the game, just having a character who can talk, who can walk around, but who isn't capable of deception. I just don't think it's very interesting to find yourself caught in an endless loop of a specific chain of actions, like in the correct order. Even if you figured out what the right order was, you would still have to wait for the loop to play itself out again. And none of those actions were interesting because the characters were babies. It was, you can pull on this guy's leg, or you can cry, or you can take this toy out of this particular child's hand, and it was annoying.
So, a couple of responses there. When I thought this was going to be about preschool-age children, I was going to ask how accurate the depiction felt to you. But I can't even ask you how well it captures the experience of being a baby, because it's not really trying. One of the many commonalities it shares with Lost Pig is that just as the narration in the Pig game was filtered through Grunk's consciousness, this is filtered through that of the baby protagonist. Except, Lost Pig could use time-honored caveman speak for Grunk, while this protagonist can't talk at all. So the conceit here is that his narration sounds like, like a 9th grader posting on Reddit. The two main writing gimmicks are, 1, lots of comma splices, and 2, the word all before every adjective, like the sky is all blue. And it's distinctive, but it has nothing to do with the real stages of language acquisition. So ultimately, playing this to get a window into the minds of babies is like trying to get an insight into the minds of dogs by watching Paw Patrol. But while Child's Play may not be about exploring the experience of being a young child, I do think that unlike Lost Pig, it is about something other than puzzles and jokes. This felt to me very much like a write what you know game. As I recall, Stephen Grenade's kids were born in the mid-2000s. I have to assume that the genesis of this game was going to one or more of these playdates and dreaming up ways that the dynamics involved could be turned into IF puzzles. But a lot of the content of this game is actually the conversation among the parents that happens in the background. And I remember Stephen telling me around this time about how a lot of the chatter among new parents, both online and in person, was this sort of passive-aggressive sniping about whose parenting style was better. You're letting her eat that? Wow. Well, you do you. Bless your heart. And we see some of this in the game. It does seem like, for all the puzzles, the real content of the game is this window into the world of a new parent circa 2007. So my question is, you have a lot more dealings with newish parents than I do. Does this aspect of the game reflect your experience?
The parents that I've encountered in real life are less annoying. I feel like everybody just wants what is best for their child, and they're coming from different contexts and they have access to different information about which way is best. But from my perspective, usually parents are coming to me for advice, or they're saying, this is how we've been doing things at home. Do you think there's a way we could continue that here at school? Or they'll ask me, oh, he's been having a really hard time controlling his emotions and keeping his hands to himself. Do you have any advice for me? So I think from my perspective, I'm usually treated as a person who has answers. I don't really get parents arguing with me about their parenting, at least not these days. I've been doing it long enough that it seems like parents are pretty happy to just sort of take my word for things. I don't see the parents talking to each other very often, and when I do, like our school does coffee socials where the parents hang out and drink coffee and talk about their kids. Whenever I've overheard snippets of conversation, it's usually like commiseration or relating to one another about aspects of parenting, like, oh, Louis gotten sick so many times since he started school here, and, talking about the various bugs that their kids bring home. Or, we've been working so hard on potty training. Sometimes groups of parents will all decide around the same time that their kid is going to be potty trained, and it's clear that they've been talking about the topic with one another, but I'm not really privy to what goes on in those conversations, so I can't attest to the accuracy of the dialogue that's in the game, from the parents at least.
All right. And then there's response number 2. A few minutes ago, you brought up your reaction to the puzzles in this game. So I wanted to wrap up by addressing that aspect of Child's Play. I went into this a little bit in the Lost Pig segment, but to expand a bit. Back in the mid-'80s, if you went into an Egghead Software or an electronics boutique and looked through the shelves, you'd find all sorts of different games to buy, but there were a few distinct brands that stood out. I was really into Electronic Arts. I put many, many hours into Archon, and Pinball Construction Set, and 7 Cities of Gold, and of course Starflight. But every one of these stores would also have at least a couple of shelves of those gray Infocom boxes, and some people imprinted on those games. So 10 years later, you had about 200 of those people hanging out in the interactive fiction news groups. And that's the group that the authors among them were writing for. That ain't me. The one Infocom game I bought in the 80s was Trinity, and after 11 months, I hadn't made it out of the prologue. In the 90s, I did buy a couple of the Infocom collections, and I liked the middle section of A Mind Forever Voyaging, but I had no interest in the puzzly ones like Spellbreaker. So when I discovered that there were now free tools to make these text games, my reaction was, wow, cool, an opportunity to make something not like Infocom. I didn't really know what I wanted to write instead, and I wound up trying a lot of different stuff. But that put me in the late 90s group that was pushing IF in new directions. And I think a lot of my guests these days have come to IF after discovering one of these offshoots. Whether it's one of my games, or Twine, or choice-based stuff, or what have you. But they did have some pre-existing interest in some form of interactive fiction before coming on. You are the first person I've had on this show who went into this with no interest in IF as a medium. The idea was that we'd talk not about form, but about content. But then the content turned out to be about babies. And the form wound up being a deal breaker. It's one thing to have a guest say, the puzzles were frustrating, I had to go to the hints, the game wasn't fun. But it was another to be playing this with you and see you getting more upset with each turn.
I guess it's the same reason that you don't enjoy playing most traditional video games. I remember trying to play a game with you, it might have been Psychonauts, and there was some acrobatic technique that was tricky to perform with the right sequence of button presses, and you were like, I know I'm supposed to get up on that ledge, but the fact that I'm being punished for not being able to push the buttons in the right sequence fast enough makes me not want to play. How is this even fun, or why is it fun? It's kind of like that, except more tedious. I feel like with a traditional video game, there's visual input and there's the sense that you are there as this avatar. Even when you're like jumping up on a ledge and you keep falling down over and over again and you know you're supposed to push this button to get up there at the right angle, I feel like there's a sense of triumph for me when I'm able to master it and like get to the ledge that I'm supposed to get to, because I can see it happening. I can feel it happening in a way, like it feels like I'm there. But when it's text-based and the text is the same over and over again, like the same events are happening in the same order, and only my sequence of actions is changing, it's just agonizing. It's like when you're reading a book and you're not really paying attention and you get hung up on a sentence and you find yourself having to read it a few times in a row before you process it, except worse, because I knew what I was supposed to do, but making one mistake meant not only having to start the loop over, but having to live out the remainder of the loop I was currently in, and it was really frustrating and not fun at all. And that's only like after I figured out what the solution to the puzzle was, But before that, not knowing the answer to the puzzle and having to dick around to figure out what the solution could be, that part just made me feel stupid. And it feels really bad to be made to feel stupid by a game that's about babies.
If you haven't played Child's Play, this may sound like an overreaction. It is not. Ellie and I played part 1 together, and to get out of part 1, you need to get a toy, get picked up by Parry, drop the toy in his lap, squirm, and get put down. The reason you drop the toy in his lap is that Jemison will want the toy, so Jemison will get picked up by Parry, so Parry can't stop you from getting to the backpack. Now, while that interaction is happening, you also have to make sure that Marion has the backpack at just the right time to take the onesie out of it, then give Zoe a toy at exactly the right moment so that Marion will deal with her, and you have no moves to spare to get to that backpack. You have to crawl diagonally, and then you can get your toy. And I simplified that a bit. So maybe the thinking here is, sure, maybe 90% of people will say, oh, that's not fun. But my game is for the 10% of people who will enjoy it. Because there are Legacy Infocom fans who will say, wow, what a fiendish puzzle. That really would have been worth my $30 back in 1985. And the coding is so sophisticated. Which it is. It takes a lot of Inform expertise to get characters to move around based on their own goals like this. And since you're a baby, you can't pull yourself up and hold things at the same time. So anything you want to hang on to, you have to put in your mouth, and the game actually tracks how much saliva ends up on the object in that process. And it's really just top-notch programming. And if there are some players, like you and me, who say that all that programming is in service of creating an experience that isn't fun, well, you can't please everyone. And we can go play other games. Like Float Point. I like that one. But what playing Child's Play with you showed me is that this is like someone who runs a hipster ice cream shop saying, oh, maybe only 10% of my customers will like my cricket and mealworm ice cream, but I made that flavor for those 10% of customers. The other 90%, they can order the bacon ice cream or something. But the thing is, those are the percentages of the people who would go to the hipster ice cream shop in the first place. If you want to expand your customer base, and you do so by giving out taster spoons of crickets and mealworms, you're going to end up with a bunch of people swearing never to set foot in your shop. And I think that if you were to present this game, and games like it, not to people who did a web search for text adventure games, but just to some randomly selected, intelligent laypeople, maybe 1% would say solving this puzzle is fun, 9% would say that it's not fun and would prefer a game that's more about choices than puzzles, and 90% would be like you and say, this is torture, and I am never playing one of these games ever again. Now, I have no idea what the IF authors of 2024 are doing. Maybe games like Lost Pig and Child's Play look like relics to the current generation of authors, and so no one needs to learn that puzzles can poison players' opinion of interactive fiction as a whole. But I do wonder now, how many other players out there over the years tried a game with puzzles that were so nasty that they scared those players away from the entire medium. So that brings us to our final segment for this episode, which is about An Act of Murder by Christopher Huang. Back in our IFMA days, he went by the cheery handle of Misery, and when I checked into what he's up to nowadays, I discovered that he's become a published author of mystery novels. So I guess that, in a way, this game kicked off his career. It took second place in the 07 comp, the second time that Christopher had finished in second. The first time was in 1998 with his game Muse. An Act of Murder also won the Zizzy for Best Individual Puzzle and was nominated in 6 other categories, including Best Game. And here to talk about it with me is another new guest, Amanda Malone, who does not hail from the interactive fiction world at all, but is someone I know from that crazy place called real life. We used to work together back before a pestilence descended upon the land. So, normally I'd start the introduction by asking for your IF origin story, how you discovered interactive fiction, since, like many of my guests, you're a bit too young to have been going to Egghead Software and the Electronics Boutique back in 1985, and seeing all the gray Infocom boxes lined up on the shelf. But my understanding is that you don't have an IF origin story, that you didn't encounter it in a class or follow some links to the IF archive. You're brand new to this.
Well, thanks for making me feel young. My name's Amanda Malone. I'm an English PhD student at UC Irvine. And yeah, I had never played any interactive fiction or really knew what it was until I met you and learned that you write interactive fiction. So I thought I would give it a try since you presented the opportunity.
So before we get to your experience with your first IF game, what's an Act of Murder all about?
So the plot is that my name is Hugh Dunnett as the player, and I'm an inspector. So I'm investigating the murder of Frederick Shepard, who is a patron of the theater. And he is found dead in the cove at the foot of the cliff behind his house. And so, at the command of the chief inspector, Duffy, I'm investigating the murder. There's some really great descriptions of the way that the house is set up. As you move through it, you meet different characters that are connected to Frederick Shepard in some way. First, Deborah Wolf, who is his niece, and then her husband, Alexander Wolf, is a playwright working on a play with Eleanor Lamb, who's a friend, and her brother, Benedict Lamb, is also there. They say chaperoning, but just hanging out at the house. And then we also meet Cedric Crane, who is Frederick Shepard's accountant.
So there you go. On top of the detective being named Hugh Dunnett, the suspects are A, B, C, D, and E, and the dead guy is F. Also, the suspects are a crane, 2 wolves, and 2 lambs, and the dead guy is a shepherd.
Yes.
I guess it's up to each player to decide whether to giggle or to wince. So, how did your first try at an IF game go?
So I attempted to play it twice and did not solve the murder either time. The first time was incredibly frustrating because I had no idea what commands you could use. So it took me a while to realize, like, okay, you can walk in directions. You can pick objects up. You can ask people about their alibi. There's like a real limited set of things that you can do. And the first time I played, I ended up somewhere on a beach next to the dead body, just like turning around in a circle forever. And could not figure out how to leave the beach. So I started the game over. And the second time was much more successful, but a very, very long experience. It's pretty detailed spatially. So you walk in through the front door of the house, and I was able to make a full map of what it looked like. You have the central hall and you have arches going in all different directions. So you can walk through to the library and then to the terrace. There's a kitchen off one end and then a dining room and a conservatory. So there's all these different rooms. And then there's objects in the room so that you can inspect. And then there's people in each different room that you can ask questions. So I started by just seeing what I was able to inspect or pick up or what directions I was able to walk in. And then I started going around asking everybody what they thought about the objects that I picked up, which was mildly helpful. The middle of the game, I got super frustrated. So you're supposed to solve the murder, think about who you want to arrest, and then you can call Chief Inspector Duffy and tell him to come and make the arrest. So at some point in the middle of the game, I kept thinking, I'm just going to call him. And by the time he gets down here, maybe I'll figure it out. I did call him, and honestly, he never came and I never figured it out.
Wait, he never showed up?
Yeah.
That sounds like a problem. Like an actual bug. He's supposed to show up in 5 minutes.
Well, it was a long 5 minutes then. Yeah, he never showed up. But the most progress I made in trying to actually solve the mystery of who did the murder was when I started asking people just directly, what do you know about the murder?
And how did you ask that? Since this game doesn't have menu conversation, what command did you use?
I think I just said, ask Deborah about the murder, ask Cedric about the murder. And then I get like 2 paragraphs of text about when they arrived, what time they got to dinner, what time they finished dinner, where they were after dinner, what room they were in, who they were with, in which room. I have like 43 pages of printed out text from how far I got in the game the second time. So I would say if you play the game, just ask people about the murder. The other way that I got information that was helpful was asking people about the ledger that I found in the study. So there's a ledger that has red pen all over it. So you can ask about the ledger. And then there's a scrap of paper in the study too that has a phone number on it. So you can call the bank manager of Frederick Shepherd. And he at least gives some information about a time that he spoke with Frederick Shepherd, which is potentially helpful. And then some of the objects that were helpful as well were the rifle. There's a rifle in the study. And if you pick it up and you go around and ask people about the rifle, everybody has a different story. Deborah says the rifle is always loaded. And then a couple other people say that the rifle is just decoration, which is interesting.
That is interesting. I did not pick up on that.
Mm-hmm. There's a few objects, though, that I wasn't, one, able to pick up, and secondly, they didn't seem to serve a purpose. Like there's a briefcase in the library. I couldn't pick it up, can't open it, and nobody knows anything about it. Or the tide table. I would love to know like what the function of the tide table is.
That I can answer. So you said that you did talk to the bank manager who establishes a time that Frederick was definitely alive.
Yeah.
That time is randomized and is different every playthrough. So when you find the dead body, it's soaking wet. So that means Frederick was dead before the high tide reached him.
Okay.
And the tide table, which is also randomized, tells you when that is. And that narrows down the window of when the murder could have occurred.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting.
Now, one thing I'm not super clear on is that you also have to get the tape measure to see how far away from high tide he could have been killed. And there's some math involved, but you don't have to do the math yourself. Duffy can do the math for you.
Oh.
From what I've read, the game doesn't actually do the math right because it treats tides as linear rather than sinusoidal. But I haven't seen the code, so I don't know whether that's actually true. Anyway, as I understand it, the idea is that you can eliminate a couple of suspects because they have alibis for that time window, and which ones will depend on what the time window is. And then I think you can eliminate some others based on motive or on access to the murder weapon, and the murder weapon also varies each time. I played one where it was the fireplace poker and another where it was the pistol. And since there are only 5 characters, you can eventually narrow it down to 1. So way back in the 90s, I remember doing a panel discussion that brought up mystery games and how a computer program can determine whether you really understand what happened. Like, sure, you can arrest a suspect, but how does the game know whether it's for the right reason?
Well, I tried to arrest someone because I was like, let me just see. Like, let's get out of here. And so I tried to arrest Deborah. And the response is, you need to call Duffy first. So I'm like, fine. I go call Duffy and he says he's coming. And then I wait and wait and wait. And I put arrest Deborah again. It won't let me. And it says you have to wait for Duffy. So then I tried the command wait. And it just says time passes. And that's it. So couldn't arrest anybody.
I think you have to do the wait command 20 times
Oh, really? Okay.
because each turn is 15 seconds and it takes Duffy 5 minutes to arrive. Some games let you actually type wait 5 minutes or wait 20 turns, but for this one, you just have to be persistent. But in case you're curious, on my first playthrough, I pretty much gave up and just arrested someone at random. And I don't know whether I picked the wrong person or whether I just didn't relay enough information to Duffy, but it said the case went to trial and the evidence was very weak and the defendant was acquitted and I was disgraced.
Oh my God. That's funny.
But the second time through, which I played with heavy recourse to the hints, I wound up just rattling off a bunch of tell commands to Duffy. Tell Duffy about Alexander's alibi. Tell him about Benedict's alibi, and so on. Tell him about the ledger. Tell him about the phone call. Tell him about the tide table. Tell him about the body position. You just tell him about 100 different things, and he will solve the mystery for you. He says, aha, that clears Alexander and Benedict. And that clears Cedric and Eleanor. So I guess we only have one suspect. So then I could arrest that suspect. In my playthrough, it was Deborah. And she says, all right, you got me. And that's basically it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Your point about eliminating characters based on what you know about time and the tides and their relationship to the objects too is interesting versus motives. Because initially, the only information I was getting was about potential motives, but it's never really clear motive-wise who did the murder.
Yeah, in my successful playthrough, there was a bit in which I told Duffy about some evidence I'd found that Cedric had been embezzling money. And Duffy said, well, that clears Cedric because he'd want to keep Frederick alive. And I was like, okay, Sarge, I'm not sure I follow the logic there, but I'm no detective. If you say that clears Cedric, then that clears Cedric. I'm with you. But that actually brings me to what I guess is my main thought on this game. I don't have a ton to say about it because, like Lost Pig, it's not really about anything. It's a randomized mystery without the sort of thematic content that made Knives Out so good. I kind of feel like we've missed an opportunity because here I've got a guest wrapping up her doctorate in literature, and I didn't find anything literary to talk about.
I didn't either.
But I will say that I was struck by how inert the game is. You get your big initial text dumps, and then each character picks a room to go to, and they just sit there. You can wander around the house as you like, but nothing happens while you're poking around. No one follows you from one room to another. Characters don't confront each other. It's a very dead space. There was one point when the game said that in the direction of the study, I could hear the sound of a window breaking. And I thought, aha, someone else is crawling around the house, probably the murderer, trying to hide clues or trying to kill me. And then no, it's just the radio.
I know. I was hoping that there would be something interesting going on with the wireless, but at some point I finally just turned it off. And the response was like, oh, thank God you turned it off. That thing was annoying.
And on top of that, the conversations don't feel like actual conversations. You just feed the characters keywords and they give you canned replies. If you ask them the same thing twice, they'll give you the exact same reply all over again in the exact same words. There was one point when I came across Eleanor playing the piano. So I tried the command, play piano, and the game said, your playing is abominable. There was no recognition that, hey, I just interrupted someone who was playing the piano, and she would probably react to that. But what that part about Duffy a couple of minutes ago got me thinking about is this. Apart from the hints, which you have to leave the game world to access, there's nothing in the game to give you little nudges if you get stuck. Like, what if Duffy didn't leave and you were assisting him, and you each contributed to the case, and your score was based on what percentage you solved versus what percentage he solved? Or you could have an assistant of your own who might say, if you overlook the ledger a couple of times, hey, Inspector, I think I see a ledger over there. I think it would be really helpful for players who are new. or players like me who aren't new but are still spinning their wheels. So I guess that brings me to my final question, which is, you've talked about your experience trying out an act of murder, but how did you feel about it? Were you like, well, it's a learning experience, maybe next time around we can look for something a little friendlier? Or were you like, nope, this is frustrating and I'm never playing one of these ever again?
I initially felt frustrated, but when I started to actually get some information from people, either about objects or about the murder by asking the right questions, I became more interested in it. And then I think, secondly, actually trying to reconstruct the world visually just on a piece of paper made it more interesting to me because that was helpful. So if I played it again, I would draw a map and I would write down every single time that somebody has given me in terms of like where they said they were during the murder. But yeah, I would play it again.
Well, that's a relief. I don't want to lose another guest after just one appearance. I guess it's a good thing that the suspects in this murder weren't babies. And that's it for Ask Tell number 17. Many thanks to my guests, Kat Zhang, Ellie Darling, and Amanda Malone, and to the authors of the games, Hota Sergeant in Misery, aka Admiral Hota, Stephen Grenade, and Christopher Huang. And thank you for listening. Next time we'll wrap up 2007, and can we also squeeze in a game or two from 2008? Yes, we can! But in the meantime, bye for now.